stations and regional sports networks. All right. Welcome, Anzio.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you for having me, and thanks for those who are joining us today. I'm gonna be real quick with this presentation, but I also want to just start off by saying that this is just one way of how to do things. It is through my experiences, whether it's at NBC Universal and or through the other 12 and 13 television stations that I've worked at, across the country in my career. So, how to cover race, NBC Universal Local. First thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about what I do, so you can understand the perspective of how I come from. If we get to the next slide, we have 42 locally owned television stations. You can see the ones in blue are the NBC, the ones in red are the Telemundo stations, and then the ones that have the double dots are where our duopolies are. And that's kind of important, just kind of just see that, what I do is my job is looking at DEI for all of our stations from a perspective of content. What does our DEI look like in our content? What does DEI look like in our culture? And what does DEI look with our people? If you go to the next slide, that'll be great. We also have regional sports networks, and we just roll them under us, and now they also operate off of the same DEI principles and platforms. And then when you go to the next one, the next slide here, you get a chance just to really see that we're not just in the local news space and sports space. We also have NBC LX, which are our TV and streaming services that targets adults 18 to 45. It's really a more innovative storytelling type approach to just journalism. And then you got Cozy TV. There's a multicast. Tele-Exodus is also a multicast. Both of those are national networks for English and Spanish. You got Neckin, which is a cable news that goes along with our stations in Boston. And LX TV is our in-house production type of company. NBC Spot On is how we use a process we use for our advertising and our businesses that kind of combines all of our OTT and all the things that we do here. Sky Castle is our in-house marketing and promotions and what we do there, how we it's our own little division of in-house marketing. And then the last one is NBC Everywhere. And literally NBC Everywhere really means NBC Everywhere. So you can see our products in taxis, gas stations, airports, inside of airports, at the baggage, at the luggage, you name it. By the time we get finished, you'll probably won't be able to get to the urinal in the bathroom without seeing our products, and that's certainly okay with us. You go to the next slide, that'll be great. So how do we cover race? One, we always talk about setting our journalists up for success. Setting up for success starts with the conversations. The conversations that we have in our newsrooms are really important. So you'll hear me talk a lot about proper preparation prevents poor performance. Proper preparation prevents poor performance. It is my belief that a lot of times when we fall short as journalists, it usually starts on the leadership side. And so we have to work very hard for the leadership side of, are we putting our people in positions to succeed? Are we giving the tools that they need? Are we preparing them through our proper conversations about what we expect in a story? What do we expect for some of the outcomes? And how are we involving DEI through that starting point, that setup point? And then identify newsroom gaps. What is it that we don't have? That's, leadership or anybody else in the newsroom should just look around and say, yes, you can look at the news team as a whole. But a lot of times the way we operate on the broadcast side or even print, you have to look at diversity even within shifts. And so if you're having a conversation and the right folks are not at the table, how do you achieve that? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. You have to set standards. And I'm happy to say that we have a standards division at NBC Universal, and your standards should mean something. There should be some accountability to your standards. And so set some standards. Create diverse resource guides. That's something you want to do on the front end. How do you make sure you have, resources that are people of color, that are, that are veterans, that are part of the disabled community. You name it, you want to make sure you have those diverse resources at your fingertips. Most of the time, by the time we know we need something for a reporter, they're under a time crunch. And it's no doubt the reporters will go the path of least resistance. So if you don't do this on the front end, if you're not creating this, if you don't have a team that's working on this, or if it's not an entire newsroom, working on creating this diverse resource guide, for instance, all of a sudden, if you interview a financial expert and he was great, and that's one particular story, and he just happens to be a Hispanic male, uh, somebody drop his name and number down. And so the next time the market goes up or goes down or what have you, and then you're looking for this person of color, then you got somebody that you've already seen, you've already checked him out, and and he's done well on TV. So that's what creating a diverse resource guide is. And then welcome tough and uncomfortable conversations. A lot of times folks shy away from uncomfortable conversations. I prefer to have the uncomfortable conversations, the tough conversations on the front end. On the front end. In journalism, we have to get out of that idea of post-mortems, after the fact when things don't go right. We want to make sure that we're having conversations on the front end so things can go right, and we'll allow them to go right. We're facilitating things go right. When you see a athlete and coaches, athletes and coaches in the locker room after the game, if the coach is doing a lot of talking after the game, they lost. I prefer doing the talking and having the conversations on the front end so that we can get to where we need to be. R before the I is a big part of proper preparation and preventing the poor performance. The R before the I. The R is relationships. The I is the issues. If you have a relationship before the issue, your issue is not going to be as big. It's great for newsrooms and news leaders. I'm telling our news leaders all the time, hey, if you haven't reached out to the leader of your pride community, leader of the LGBTQ organization, if you haven't reached out to your urban leagues, your NAACPs, the AAPIs, on the front end before something happens, because something will happen. Some reporter will accidentally say something, or somebody will, or a particular organization is going to feel a certain way, feel slighted or whatever. If they have a relationship with you before the issue, the issue is easier to have better conversations. So that's on us to facilitate those relationships and establish those relationships, on the front end. Measurability and accountability. Boy, I tell you what, I didn't like this as a news director, but I love it now in my current role. Everything that we do from the DEI perspective has to be measurable, and there has to be a system for accountability. So measurability, we measure everything else that we do in our profession. We measure ratings. We're looking at ratings every single day. We're looking at shares. We're looking at how many people watching us, when they're turning, when they're leaving. Every 15 minutes, we know every single thing about it. Why can't we measure our DEI process and our progress? And what we know is that if you don't measure it, it will not change. So we're all about measuring it. But then part of measurability is accountability. As a kid growing up, I would be given some expectations of things I need to be done. I wish there was no accountability, but guess what? There was. And in just about everything we do, there's accountability. And I think accountability needs to be had on this point as well, too. So let's get more to covering race. Let's go to the next page here. And so, one of the things that we do in covering race is we started our racial justice and news guidelines. So we created a task force to put together some guidelines for our organizations, for all of our newsrooms. And that includes everything from covering crime, mug shots, how do we treat surveillance video, cell phone video, suspect descriptions and sketches, and our sourcing. And if I go back to just one of the things we do in the race is the suspect descriptions and sketches. We're asking our journalists to be critical thinkers about crime, to also recognize that we are not a part of police. We don't work hand in hand with police. That is, that it's something that we need to make sure everybody understands, that we don't work for them. They don't work for us. We're not, adversaries, but also just because they give us a a description that may sounds like it has a lot of information on it, we have to be critical thinkers and look at it and say, okay, hey, does this really help our audience out before we put this on TV? I can't tell you how many times I've heard the description: black male, 6 foot tall, thin build, brown skin, brown eyes, 200 pounds, short black hair. That's a lot of details, but that's me all day long. That's me. And that looks like, this describes four of my brothers as well, too. Yep, it's five of us. So that describes all of us. That doesn't help anybody in the community, be able to identify someone or find someone. We have to challenge our police about, very detailed descriptions before we offend an entire race of people. And now sketches, they don't even really give sketches out anymore. They have these animations. They're bad. They're bad. Philadelphia gave an animation of a guy, of a suspect they was looking for. Actually, they was looking for two suspects, but they only sent one animation. And I told the newsroom, I said, they only sent one animation because the second animation looked like the first animation, which looks like every black guy that I know. I was happy to say that we were the only news organization that did not put that on TV that particular day, but others did it because I'm sure they said, oh, police gave it to us, so we used it. Now, we're better than that. We're independent of them. And so our racial justice and news guidelines covers everything from those suspect descriptions to how we put things and when we put things on TV. So when we go to the next one, part of what we're doing in our racial guidelines is how do we uh, you know what else do we do in these that can help our news team. So we're looking at our graphics and we're monitoring what our graphics look like, and how to do the graphics speak to the story, or do the graphics also feed into stereotypes. We're looking at our community imagery, overall, just looking at how many people of color do we show in positions of criminal activity inside of newscasts. Now, we're going to tell the news the way that it is. And I'm never going to sit here and say, oh, don't show this amount of stories because it includes Asian, Hispanic, or whatever. That's not the point. The point is that when we know we have a high amount of crime in newscasts and it's showing people of color in these positions of criminal activity, we have to be just as intentional and work hard to find and put people in stories that show them in positions of expertise. In positions of expertise, we know that our young adults, our kids, are going to be what they see. They're going to be what they see. So we have to be responsible in our reporting and our journalism as well too. And I do believe that it's good journalism to be intentional about finding, folks for diverse voices and in our newscasts. Uh, avoid all stereotypes. Avoid all stereotypes. There's no such thing as a good stereotype, at all. Avoid all stereotypes, no matter how good you may think they sound or whatever. You're trying to be cute. I think you just avoid them. It keeps you. It's going to keep you out of trouble. Uh, there's no difference between broadcast, digital, or social media. Your standards, your goals, your principles should go between the three very easily. A lot of people think, oh, it should be different for this one, or we should be able to say this on this one. No, when I go to Burger King to get my Whopper, it should taste the same whether I go inside, which is what I call the broadcasting, legacy broadcasting, just walking inside of a Burger King, or if I go through the drive-through, which is what I call the digital, or COVID, you call, they bring it out to your car, do all the work for you. That's the social media part. It doesn't matter. The burgers taste the same, whatever you're getting. People should get the same thing from us on all three platforms, and how we respect folks as it relates to covering race. And then the random self audits of newscasts is important for us. And so, what does a self audit look like? A self audit looks like for in the NBC family, we can look at a particular station in a particular market. We can look at their newscast for a full day, 24 hours, and we can put the amount of people that we see in each newscast. We can put them in four different buckets, and we want to measure where those buckets are. So, what are the four buckets? The first bucket is, are we showing, what's the number of people shown in positions of people of color shown in positions of criminal activity? And then you can put, what are the people that you're showing, and people of color showing in positions of authority. Positions of authority is, if you have a Asian mayor, a female, police chief, if you have a black male DA, all of those are positions of authority. They're just going to be on the newscast. There's not a lot you can do about that one way or the other. Then there's going to be the MOS bucket, which is, just have a person of color saying, hey, the weather was great today. That's that third bucket. The fourth bucket is the one that we normally find that needs work, and that is that positions of expertise of what we talked about. And then the best way to help do that is through your diverse resource guide. So then we're going to move on and just look at some DEI lingo that I think that we if you go to that next slide, the DEI lingo, that sometimes things just get twisted and people have different thoughts about it or different ways of describing it or what have you, or where specific issues may take place. So I always talk about inclusion without diversity. People say, what do you talk about inclusion without diversity? How do you achieve the inclusion when you lack diversity in your newsroom? And a prime example, I'm having a conversation with our news team. We were talking about a series of crimes that happened around the transgender community. And I'm looking around the table. We didn't have not one representative for LGBTQ, at the table, none. And we had a couple of transgender folks in our newsroom. It just wasn't there at that shift, that time of day. And so I'm looking around the newsroom trying to find somebody. Finally, call up guys, say, hey, man, I need you to participate in this conversation because we're having a conversation and none of us are really an insider. We want to make sure we don't mess this up. And he was like, all right, let's start talking. And literally somebody turned and made a comment about, and they used the term transsexual. Luckily, the employee on the phone was like, hold on, wait a minute. We're not going to do that. Let's not make that mistake no more. The proper, term is transgender, not transsexual. And so that's what inclusion is. Although we didn't have the diversity at the table at the time, it wasn't like we lacked diversity on our staff. It just wasn't there. And that happens a lot. Sometimes, looking around the room and there's a bunch of males. Somebody needs to say, hey, stop the meeting down. Let's bring, a couple of females in here into this conversation. Hey, we having a conversation about AAPI hate. We need somebody at the table. Let's call it. I don't care who that person is. It doesn't necessarily even have to be a member of the news team. It could be somebody from another team, sales. It could be somebody from church or whatever. Get somebody involved. And if you can't pick up the phone and call somebody, if you can't get in somebody, then your diversity is you have bigger issues than DEI. And then there is the diversity without inclusion. This is the next one. Diversity without inclusion. Diversity without inclusion is, to me, the worst. Diversity without inclusion is you have diverse people on your team and then you don't value their thoughts and opinions. You're not even asking them what they think. You're not even including them in the conversation. So to me, that's worse, to have diversity and you're not including people in your processes, in your decision making, in your plans. And that's when problems really do manifest themselves and you end up with just a lot of workplace complaints and people are not happy. Diversity of thought within. Do not assume that everybody that looks alike and sounds alike all think alike. They don't. They absolutely don't. I know I just happen to think a lot different from some other black males I know about different situations. So don't, again, assume that everybody does. And then don't go and get the thoughts of one particular person and put that on TV as a blanket statement. And this is how all one group feels. We have to be careful of that. And the next one is just newsroom allyship. A lot of times when something is happening to a particular person or a particular race or whether, in conversations in newsrooms, and you may be the bystander. And as the bystander, very well, it is the expectation that, you should speak up and be an ally, for the group that's at the end of whatever, it is that's happening that is not right. And that's called sticking together. And sometimes you may not recognize it when it happens. And that has happened to me. And I've kind of it takes me a little while to process things, and I may have to go back and say, hey, I want to go back to what just happened, a few minutes ago. Uh, you may not have meant this, but I'm not sure that was fair to say. I'm not sure that was the right thing to say. I'm not sure that's the right way to think. I think we should show more respect to this particular group and understanding, and then welcome someone from that particular group to speak up and say, hey, am I off on this? Am I wrong on this? I just want to make sure that we're supporting you. And so the allyship, should be intentional as well too. Transparency is big. Whatever you're doing, that's one of the main principles, founding principles of journalism is transparency. So when you're deciding something because of something, because of race, because of gender, because you know, talk it through with people in the newsroom. So a lot of times I would sit back and watch our news morning editorial meeting, and I'm listening, and I'm trying to think big picture of what our news is going to look like that day. I'm like, okay, I think we got people in this part of the community. We got a lot of people in the suburbs. We got a lot of people over here. I'm thinking we need this group of people. Hey, reporter, you're going to do a story about this new dental procedure. Can you find me a Hispanic, orthodontist? Now, I'm doing this because I'm looking at the rest of the newscast and I see that we're lacking, Hispanics in our newscast in positions of expertise. So let me know how that goes. That's just a request of me as a news director. I'm being intentional about it. It's just a request. I would say 95% of the time, my journalists they saw that as a challenge. They saw that as a unique challenge, and they usually accomplished it. They usually accomplished it, no doubt in my mind. And sometimes folks is like, where are you getting these crazy makeups on these dreams of these people or these particular folks you want to see in newscasts? And I said, we have to think big picture and about our newscast and make sure that our newscast serves the community, looks like the community that we ultimately are trying to reach. And then finally, for me, equity versus equality. And that's what the pictures represent. You've probably seen these pictures before. But I just want to just give you my take on the equity versus equality. And equality, someone is asking you, what's the difference? Because a lot of times we try to use them interchangeably, and they're far from interchangeably. We're being used interchangeably. Equity is when, let's start with equality, because the first picture there is equality. The three boxes are the same boxes. They all are getting the same thing. That's what equality is. Everybody gets the exact same thing, those three boxes. But as you can see, a little short kid on the kid there, they got the same boxes as the first two, but it doesn't help them. Equity is everybody gets what they need to succeed. Everybody gets what they need to succeed. And that's about as simple as I can, form. And so we're looking at the equity of things. What does equity look like? You hear the term pay equity. Everybody should be getting what they need and getting what, it's not always, the same. If you're looking for equality, equality is the exact same thing. And so I look forward to talking about that. If any of you have any further questions about that offline. If we go to the next page, part of our news and racial justice task force is the things that we're working on now. As I told everybody, we have a guidelines that are out, and right now we're looking at mental health references. Why should we use them in stories? When and why you should use them in stories? And based off of who said what? I love it. We say, oh, the person had mental illnesses. The person went on a shooting or did this and this, and his family said that he had mental illnesses. His family is not necessarily educated enough. My family is going to probably say, I got some mental issues. No. So that's not. And how and why should you put that in a story? I think it needs to be some context around that. It needs to be some guidelines around it, and we're doing that. The photos. Do you use the police? Provide, say, suspect was killed, and then police give you a mugshot of him from 8 years ago, or then the family gives you a picture from 2 weeks ago holding a son, and then on social media you can see right before he goes skiing or something that maybe 10 years ago. And we want to put some parameters around it. And right now we're having great conversations about it before we put the guidance out to our teams. But we're starting out with the idea that it should be something that's more recent. And how the person looked and represented the story that we were covering. Uh, we're putting language behind the terms, Indian, Indigenous people, Native Americans, Cherokee, and on what I would say about a lot of these is and or people always say, should I call them black? Should I call them African Americans? Should I call them Hispanic? Should I call them Latinos? And I'm big on making sure reporters ask somebody how would they like to be identified. But one, you got to ask yourself, is it relevant for the story? And a lot of times there is some relevance to the story, especially in over the last year and a half or whatever. But make sure you ask a person how they would like to be identified. That is key. Don't assume by by what your eyes tell you. Uh, Clothing descriptions. We're putting some guidance around clothing descriptions and what they look like. We just saw this past week. There was a baseball uh, analyst who was talking about a player's head garb, and he described it as a do rag, which he couldn't have been further from the truth. So we have some things already in the guidelines about clothing descriptions. We're adding more, and make sure we give them proper context and proper ways to pronounce things and proper ways what to call stuff. And then at the end, we're also working on grace and forgiveness. And what is grace and forgiveness for us, and from a DEI perspective? What happens when someone calls the newsroom and said, "Hey, I was arrested for shoplifting, and 9 years ago, and the charges were dropped. But you guys ran a story, and that story continues to live on your website, and you ran something on TV, and it's just living, and it's stopping me from getting a job. I'm 8, 9 years removed from that." And so, what does grace and forgiveness looks like in terms of helping out folks and giving people a second chance, especially when they have been exonerated, proven not guilty, or what have you? And so, we're working on what we call a grace and forgiveness program. So, I went through a lot of this kind of quickly, and so I don't know if there are questions, and I'd love to take some questions. I'd love to have a conversation, if you will. And so, Lindsay, you tell me how we should facilitate this.
Well, Amy and I were just chatting, and we thought that since there are quite a few professors and those types in the Zoom, do you want to hop in Zoom and then we can just have an easier back and forth?
Sure, sure, sure. So I will hop over into the Zoom and come out of this one. All right, so I'm
Okay.
gonna get out of this